earlier three lectures on capitalist industrialization, we talked about the various aspects which were related to the capitalist industrialization. We also talked about the ideas which have been given by Karl Marx in the last lecture. We talked about how he tries to see the primitive accumulation and the capitalist ideas which are associated with this kind of the kind of development which took place at this point of time. And we also see that when you talk about the various kinds of developments at this point of time and the kind of issues which were concerned with the capitalist industrialization, where workers, they were being in a way treated in a very unfair manner because of the developments which were happening, and how this kind of a change which especially came in Britain, and how it could not come to the France earlier. These were some of the issues. They have also been talked about by the scholars, and we realize that how Marx, he has seen it in the framework of the capitalist these kinds of developments in the issue of class conflict as well. And over a period of time, we also realize that how the servile labor which was being used in the colonies, slave trade and commercial wars, that where we find that British, they prospered in these regions, and over a period of time Dutch, they were being replaced as the dominant mercantile power by 1700 in these regions. And how the government laws, monopolies, taxes and debt, they assisted this kind of a process. And we find that how Marx sees that how state definitely played an important role, or it was one of the principal progenitors and the servants in that sense. And how we find that when you talk about the ideas of proto-industrialization, and these kinds of ideas, they actually started with the Franklin Mendel's 1969 dissertation at the University of Wisconsin, Industrialization and Population Pressure in the 18th Century Flanders. And it was a study of the relatively rapid population growth experienced in an internal region of Flanders, where a peasant population combined agriculture with part-time linen manufacture. So we find that how the people, those who were employed in the agricultural sector, they also allied themselves with the allied industries which were the primary sector, which were the primary industries. But apart from agriculture, they were also engaged in other sectors which were there. And when you talk about the kind of output which was being generated during this time, how it was being sold in the overseas markets by the entrepreneurs in Ghent and the other market towns to the distant markets, especially those of the Spanish Empire. So we find that this kind of a trade definitely benefited them, but it also created such kind of a route for them for further getting engaged in the exchange of goods and services in these regions. And we find that the people, those who are engaged in the production of these goods, workers, the family units of the husband, wife and children, and how they also cultivated small plots of land as well. And although they also bought additional supplies in the markets. And we find that over a period of time, how the term has been subsequently been defined and extended in both time and space to other similar industries. So we see that this kind of a work which was being done in their own homes initially, but when the factory system came, then these people, they had to go to the factories to work. But when you talk about proto-industrialization kind of a setup, where we find that husband, wife and children, they were working at their own home and they were producing goods, and then these goods, they were being taken by the merchants, and either they were being sold in the local regions, or largely they were being sent to other areas as well. And when you take examples, for example, the Lancashire cotton industry, it has been seen as some kind of a prelude to a fully developed factory system. And we see in others as well that how, such as the Irish and even Flemish linen industries, we find that no such kind of transitions, they occurred in these industries. And so we cannot have a very specific kind of a development in every sector or in every industry. This is what we can deduce from these kinds of examples, and how proto-industrialization, it had the distinctive patterns of development, and it generally originated in the pastoral regions and the declining or large scale agricultural areas. So, we find that how this kind of a pattern of proto-industrialization, which is seen to be a phase before the industrial activity, it developed during this particular period. And when you talk about the scholars, those who have talked about this kind of a sector, how they in a way see the importance of the interconnections among the widening markets, the markets which were not in one region, and the rising population, especially in the rural sector. And we also see that how the wage earning employment was also, these people, those who were seeking the wage earning employment and the search for the cheap labor by the entrepreneurs as well, that how entrepreneurs, they were trying to seek the cheap labor, because when they will have cheap labor, then only they will be able to maximize their profits. And this happens even now, that how industrialists, they are engaged in seeking cheap labor in that sense, and how industries even in the modern times, they operate on this basis, despite the fact that they have to they have to follow certain guidelines which are there, and in the framework of the laws which have been made or reformed from time to time. And we find that how, when you talk about the rural household and the regional changes and the kind of studies of industrialization before the industrialization by the Peter Criddle et al. In Göttingen in 1981, and how it attempted to situate the proto-industrialization within transition from feudalism to capitalism. So, this kind of a debate with regard to this kind of a transition has been there among the various scholars, and they have tried to see this in this particular framework, and how proto-industrialization is credited with creating some kind of changes in the use of land, labor, capital and entrepreneurship, which is the four factors of production. And this is how we find that all these four factors of production, they made the industrial activity or industrialization possible. And when you talk about the generation of the supplementary handicraft income, how it will lead to an expansion of population, breaking up self-regulating or homeostatic equilibrium of pre-industrial population. By this process, the natural rate of growth of the population increases, but also becomes adjusted to the augmented means of subsistence that are locally available. And accordingly, we find that the handicraft, they generated labor supply of industrial revolution. So, first aspect largely talks about the supplementary handicraft production and which generated income as well, and how it was being seen or linked to the population growth, and how population growth definitely also created some kind of a demand where more goods they were to be produced, and over a period of time they provided the extra hands as well, where we find that because of the rise in the rate of the growth of population, how this population needed products. And secondly, we also see that a region that experiencing growing population and the growing proto-industrialization will soon begin to encounter diminishing returns, as dispersed industry creates difficulties in the collection of output and the control of quality. So, this will in a way conduce to the concentration of manpower in the workshops, and then to use of labor saving mechanical inventions, which also happened. And in this way, we find that proto-industrialization created pressures leading to factory system and to new technology. So, factory system was also being created, where we find that now workers, they were going to the factories to work. So, this also created some kind of a division of work as well at home as well, because now women, they had to take care of the homes. So, we see that when you talk about proto-industrialization, and as a result of this, we find that the development capital for these workshops or the introduction of machines will accumulate locally, in the hands of the merchants and the commercial farmers or landowners, and in this manner proto-industrialization is supposed to have led to accumulation of capital. And it will also lead to the accumulation of technical knowledge by merchants as a result of the experience with interregional and international trade, where they will have also the technical knowledge, and how it will also provide some kind of a technical ground or training ground in which early industrialists were recruited and a new supply of entrepreneurs also emerged. And we also see the simultaneous development of the proto-industrialization and the regional commercial agriculture. It will also prepare the agricultural sector for the task of supplying food during urbanization, which accompanies subsequent phase of industrialization. So we find that how proto-industrialization leads to agriculture surpluses and reduces the price of food. So, and it was a very remarkable kind of a development or necessity in that sense, because unless food availability is there, then the populations, they will not be able to survive in that sense. So this kind of a surplus which was being generated, it was some kind of a welcome step for the industrial activity. And we find that proto-industrialization in the related terms, they refer primarily to the consumer goods industries, especially textiles, and well before the advent of factory system in the cotton industry. However, other large scale highly capitalized industries, they existed, producing the capital or the intermediate goods, and sometimes even the consumer goods as well. And we find that how when you talk about the British industry and the British industrial revolution, we also compare it with the industrial activity in the other regions, that why other regions of the world, they could not or did not grow at a faster pace in that sense as the developments that took place in Britain. But we find that in some regions of Europe, the industrial activity, though it took later than the industrial activity in Britain, but it definitely took place at a very faster rate. And we find that how the French manufacturers, royals, were usually located in large factory like structures where skilled artisans, they worked under the supervision of a foreman or entrepreneur, but without any mechanical kind of power. So definitely developments in the French industry, they were definitely there, and how people, they were also being employed, they were working, but at the same time they did not have any mechanical power in that sense to work. And we find that how the proto industries or proto factories rather, they were built by the noble entrepreneurs and landowners in the Austrian empires, Bohemia and Moravia and elsewhere as well. And we also see that large landowners, they were also acting as entrepreneurs in the coal industry, mining deposits which are located in their estates, and the iron works usually located in the rural areas near timber or charcoal and iron ore. They also sometimes employ hundreds and even thousands of workers. So we find that how landowners, where these kinds of minerals etc. and other resources, they were also available, so they also employed labor on a large scale in that sense, and how this labor definitely was playing an important role or also exhibiting some kind of symbols or sign with regard to the factory system. And we find that other kinds of resources, whether you see it in the framework of the glassworks, copper, lead, and also we find that they also frequently had large scale organizations and did shipyards as well. And how the state was playing an important role, where we find that the state owned arsenals of Venice dating from the Middle Ages was one of the earliest large scale enterprises in history. And the scholars, they have tried to see these kinds of developments and try to relate them with this kind of an activity in these regions. And we find that Emanuel Wallerstein has talked about the capitalism was from beginning a matter of world economy and not of nation states. This is how he has seen capitalism. And we find that he has also talked in the framework that how it has never allowed its aspirations to be determined by national boundaries, because Wallerstein has tried to see this system within the framework of the world, and he is not concerned with that how it was not restricted by the boundaries. And he says that the only kind of social system in a world system which we define quite simply as a unit with a single division of labor and multiple cultural systems. So this is how he refers to it. And he also says there could be two varieties of such world system, one with a common political system and one without it. So we see that how Manuel Wallerstein has tried to see this kind of a system, and he also refers to them as world empires and world economies. And so when Emmanuel Wallerstein is talking about these aspects and he tries to in a way distinguish between them, we find that he also talks about the modern world system which created a European world economy with an unprecedented structure which originated in the 16th century Europe during what the Braudel has called long 16th century, which is from 1450 to 1660. So Fernand Braudel has talked about this kind of an aspect where he talks about this century as a long 16th century, where he takes the portions from the 15th century and also the portion from the 17th century as well, and tries to identify within that particular framework. And we find that how when you talk about the geographical limits of this world economy, it was largely determined by the state of technology at time, included Northwest Europe, which became the core of system. So when you talk about the regions, we find that the Northwestern Europe all saw these kinds of development in their own regions, and how when you are trying to divide the world into two more elements, Wallerstein placed the Eastern Europe but not Russia and Spanish America at the periphery, while the Mediterranean littoral is the coastal regions and the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, Spain and northern Italian city-states, they became some sort of a semi-periphery. So we find that developments happening in the major regions of Europe, and some of the regions, though they were part of the Europe, but they were at the periphery in that sense, because developments were not comparatively faster in these regions, or they could not take place in the way they took place in the Northwestern Europe. And how the economy in Europe, they were in a way operating at that point of time. And we find that the core areas or the central areas, they had mass market industries, international and local commerce in the hands of an indigenous bourgeoisie, and relatively advanced and complex form of agriculture. So we find that those entrepreneurs, they were coming from the from the bourgeoisie section of the society, and how these entrepreneurs, they were also over a period of time they turned into capitalists as well. So we find that when you talk about the peripheral regions, these peripheral areas, they were monocultural in nature, with cash crops produced on large estates by coerced labor. And the semi-peripheral areas were in a process of deindustrialization, although they still retained some share in international banking and high cost quality industrial production. And we see that the form of agricultural labor control used, there was mostly sharecropping, and a form that was intermediate between freedom of lease system and coercion of slavery and serfdom. This world was comprised of a multitude of political entities, and the core states, relatively strong state systems, emerged with an absolute monarch and patrimonial state bureaucracy. By contrast, the critical feature of periphery was the absence of a strong state. Semi-periphery was once again in between in its polity, and by the end of the 16th century, we find that the decline of the state authority was clear in Spain and in large city-states of northern Italy. So how state was operating in these regions, and where we find that how the role of the state was also important, especially in the core areas, as we find that when the big powers of Europe, they made colonies in these Asian and African empires, and how they got the direct or the tacit support of the state in terms of making the colonies in these regions, and how their trading activity was given some kind of a thrust by the state, and how state was in a way aligned with these companies, especially in the case of India. We see the East India Company and how East India Company was given a lot of support by the British Parliament and the British government in Britain, and various kinds of charters, though they were being controlled by the charters which were given by the crown. But we find that different kinds of concessions they were being given to them. Some kind of a policy was being made for them through these various kinds of charter. And the essential feature of a capitalist world economy is the production for the state in a market in which object is to realize the maximum profit. So we find that how when you talk about the capitalist world economy and how it is engaged in production, and this kind of production is for the market, and the market is operating on the principle of the maximum profit. So the profit has to come for the people, those who are engaged in the production process, and production is constantly expanding as well, and this kind of expansion will take place till the production is profitable. So we find that when there is a scope for increasing the production, then the capitalist would engage in that, and new kinds of innovations, they are also helping in increasing the production activity and the productivity as well. And when new kinds of innovations will come, then we find that how in the profit margins they also have to expand as well. And Wallerstein has talked about three stages in the development of the world economy. First one was one of the agricultural capitalism from 16th to 18th century, and in this stage we find that wage labor is only one of the modes in which labor is recruited and paid. And slavery, we find that it was kind of a coercion, where we find that the coerced cash crop production was also taking place, and this was a term, his term for the so called second feudalism. And we also see sharecropping and tenancy, they are all alternative modes as well. So we when Wallerstein talks about this, we find that when he talks about the world economy and the three stages of the world economy, and the first one he talks about during the 16th to 18th century, and where we find that the wage labor, definitely he talks about, that was an important concern, and how labor was being paid. And we also see that the issue of slavery was also there, that how slaves from the African and the Asian areas, they were being brought, and these slaves, they were being employed in the agricultural and other kinds of production as well. And we also see, when he talks about the second stage, how it commenced with the worldwide recession of 1650 to 1730, and we find that England first ousted Netherlands from her commercial primacy in this stage and successfully resisted France's attempts to catch up. So in that sense, Britain was able to create its own dominance in this particular phase, and that was a period where we find that some kind of a rivalry or competition between the East India companies of the Netherlands and France, which took place with Britain, and Britain was able to corner both of them. It was able to create its own predominance, and because of which we find that how India became its prized colony, and it could exploit India for nearly 200 years, and how this was some kind of a boon for the British colonial economy, and how British economy could survive, or how it was able to prosper at the expense of the colonies. And when you talk about the third stage, we find that from the mid 18th century, that capitalism became primarily industrial rather than agricultural or mercantile. And in this stage, industrial production represents a constantly growing share of world's total production. So we find that how during this particular phase, which was the third stage, as Wallerstein has argued, where capitalism was the primary industrial in nature in that sense, and industrial activity guided capitalism during this phase. And we also see that industrial production was also world's when you see the share in the world's total production, then it was consistently it was increasing. And we find that how the geographical expansion of European world economy during this time, to include entire globe in that sense, that we see that so many countries which are part of the Commonwealth, nearly they numbered around 53, 54, and so they were all the colonies of Britain at some point of time. And in this sense, we find that Wallerstein has talked about these three phases, and other theorists like Robert Brenner, M. Poston, and Emmanuel Ledo-Radorai, they have also talked about these aspects. And we see that there were different paths to industrialization when you see these kinds of changes which happened in Britain, France, or Germany, and how it first took place in Britain and thereafter in France and later in Germany. And so we will talk about these aspects in our next lecture. Thank you very much.